Welcome to another episode of Independent Thought and Freedom, where we have conversations with some of the most interesting people around the world who are shaking up politics, society, economies, and ideas. We've had some amazing guests on this program, including The Saker, Paul Craig Roberts, Sheikh Imran Hussein, E. Michael Jones, Cynthia McKinney, and more. If you'd like to support us to reach our next goal of actually putting together live events where we bring some of my best guests side by side on one stage, please consider becoming a monthly subscriber on Patreon. You'll find the link below. Also, if you are an author or researcher with important ideas to share with the world and want to have a greater impact, I'm offering a free masterclass, 3 steps on how to leverage your intellectual authority to become a media personality. The link for that class is in the description as well. And now, on to this week's show. Welcome to Independent Thought and Freedom. The world appears on edge right now. The US-China trade war, exacerbated by American support for the Antifa-like Hong Kong protests. Pakistan threatening nuclear retaliation for Indian policy in Jammu and Kashmir. The US's looming threats to Venezuela and Iran. The absolutely insane anti-Russian propaganda in the US media and the Western media in general. And fears of another economic recession are just some features of this problem. Yet at the same time, there are positive developments showing a different possible future. Tremendous development in Asia and Africa, where the bulk of humanity lives, including space exploration and the progress of the World Historic Belt and Road Initiative, which can totally change the very foundation of the world economy, but which also has been attacked relentlessly in the Western press and by neoconservative and other Western supremacist think tanks. Leading the efforts for universal development and global peace for over 40 years has been the LaRouche movement, which has been the originator of the Belt and Road idea, in the form of the New Silk Road and later the World Land Bridge. I am pleased to be joined today by Jason Ross, a leading science and economic researcher working with the LaRouche PAC and the Schiller Institute. He is co-author with Hussein Askari of Extending the New Silk Road to West Asia and Africa, and he's here to join us to discuss these crucial issues. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you here. I understand that you've just come back from a university campus or a college campus speaking about these issues. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so how was that?
Well, it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. There's a really great openness among the young people in the United States, at least the ones in New York City, I found, and according to reports around the nation, to a very different outlook on development in the United States. The kind of anti-Russia, anti-China sentiments that you had brought up that are very strongly coming from the think tanks, from the media, there's a lot more openness about this among young people, especially on campuses, as they probably have Chinese friends and a better sense of this. And the other major aspect that's very important on the campuses is that a lot of young people are being pushed in a direction that prevents development in a way that I think is invisible to them, which is by encouraging them to make strong demands for decarbonization in a way that will leave no room for the kind of development that the world desperately needs.
Yeah, that 2 points there I'd like you to elaborate on, actually. It's interesting. One is the Chinese friends, because yeah, it's very true that Chinese students find themselves all over the world, and that's interesting. I didn't think about that, how they might be providing a counter narrative on campus. Is that actually occurring? Do you see that evidence of that anywhere, or?
Well, it's because there are about 400,000 Chinese students, maybe 360,000 Chinese students currently in American universities, which is a very large number. I believe that that's the largest, as far as one country goes among international students. China is the lead. And the attacks against Chinese scholars that have come from the director of the FBI, from some US senators, have been countered in some cases by the universities themselves. Here in New York City, the president of Columbia University wrote an op-ed saying, "No, I won't spy on my students," really striking back against the anti-China assault that says that students or researchers from China are all coming to the US to steal secrets, and they're essentially spies for Beijing instead of just, people.
Yeah.
So I think the people-to-people connection is very, very important to get to know what other cultures like. It's very important because although many Americans might recognize that having prejudiced viewpoints about Black people or Hispanics or white people is inappropriate, you'd be surprised about the number of people who hold negative views about Chinese people without realizing, wait, what am I saying? Aren't we all people?
And Russians too. I mean,
that's true. That's very true. That's very true.
I just find it amazing looking from the outside here, just the types of things you'll see on TV shows, on talk shows. I mean, just this sort of vilest, stereotypical. It's like going back to like when you look at these, these Warner Brothers cartoons from 1940s of the Japanese and the way. It's really wartime propaganda. I mean, it's amazing what we're living through. It's stuff that I've read about, in the 40s or 30s or whatever, and it's right here in front of us. And and another thing that's interesting that you mentioned about young people's experience about anti-development, let's put it that way. And you're talking about decarbonization, but what came to mind was certainly what Bernie Sanders captured in 2016 and a little bit now is the whole issue of student debt. And I know that's been a big issue. But have you seen a sort of backlash to the decarbonization issue with the the Extinction Rebellion or are they really uniformly or all near uniformly programmed in a sense into that ideology?
I think that there's a general sort of cultural current about environmentalist causes, about people feeling guilty about using bags or straws, or the idea that somehow we're killing the earth. It often takes the form of these general statements that don't really mean much in particular, like asking somebody, do you believe in global warming? As though one's talking about Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny. This isn't something you believe yes or no. This is a serious topic that has so many aspects. What are the impacts of human emissions on the climate? How certain are we about our conclusions? How confident can we be in those models? And then the whole other side of things is what would be the appropriate response if there are threats that are being created? But somehow none of this, often this all just sort of turns into, are you for the climate or are you an evil climate denier? And it loses a lot of the specificity that a scientific debate ought to have. I think that there's a view or a perspective that young people are totally absorbed by this. And I don't think that's the case. We've found in campuses, not just in the United States, but around the world, we had a coordinated action day on campuses doing outreach worldwide yesterday and again tomorrow. And there are plenty of people who recognize that this is a distraction, and they recognize the negative impacts. I'll tell one anecdote. On a campus yesterday, there was a student that we were speaking with, a student from Sudan, and we were talking about development and the space program and what drives an economy. And another kid came up basically yelling and cursing at us for being climate deniers. And he spoke to the woman from Sudan and said, these people deny climate change, they're destroying the planet. And she told him, she said, I don't care about all that. We need electricity. We need power. This is a matter of escaping poverty. This is a life or death issue that's very direct. Stop talking to me about this. So I think when you think about um, the real needs that we have as a human species, and you look at the consequences not for a relatively wealthy country like the US to spend more on solar panels, but when you also put it in the context of a developing nation being told that it has to spend 5 to 10 times as much for its electricity, that is literally a death sentence to the people in that nation who are going to die from energy poverty by pursuing those policies.
Yeah, in speaking of, I mean, the topic that I started out with, the kind of global chaos and the Belt and Road Initiative as sort of an opposition to that. These issues that we're talking about here are very crucial to it because it speaks to the fundamental philosophical difference that leads you to, I suppose, one direction or the other. You know, the idea that one idea that the Earth has limited resources and that we have to we've exceeded our carrying capacity, and that there's going to be more wars over scarce resources, and as the climate is deteriorating and we're going to die and in 10 years if we don't do anything. And so it leads to this sort of all against all almost in a certain sense, which is very much behind I think this global chaos. And then on the other hand, a view that your organization, the LaRouche movement and the Schiller Institute have promoted and discussed about that, this Malthusian view of the world where everything is limited is actually totally incorrect, and you have a very different philosophy. I'd like you to expound on this philosophical difference, which these examples are just illustrations of tiny points, please.
Sure. Well, I think you really focus right on one of the most central issues, which is the view of mankind and how well people understand that. I mean, there's a difference between our species and any animal species. Animal species are limited in their relationship with their environment. It's determined by their instincts, by their biology, by the kind of predators or food that they have around them. But for us, our resources are mostly ones that we create. If you think about what are resources to us today, most of them were not resources 3,000 years ago. In ancient civilizations that go very far back, resources were things that you might find around you. Maybe you're hunting wild animals, or you're harvesting fruit that you find, or you're fishing from the seas, this sort of thing. Maybe you're using wood to produce things, or rocks. But today, we are using ores to create metals, not a resource 5,000 years ago. We're using coal or natural gas to create motion and then electricity. Electricity was not something that was even a concept or used hundreds of years ago. So what we do is we change the carrying capacity of the human species. And we do that by that distinction between us and animals. The fact that the thoughts that go through our minds can include concepts that really have power over nature to improve how we live. That our thoughts can have a resonance with the unseen principles that make the universe function, with physics. And that's something that, do dogs have thoughts? I mean, they have personalities, they have emotions, but they don't think about those things. They can't discover how to change their relationship to nature. They're fixed. So at a certain point, this really does come down to whether people are cognizant of that distinction and how well they're made aware of it. And I think this goes to education. If education takes the form of rote memorization or of learning potentially true formulas in your physics class or something, but never knowing where they came from, and you're being deprived in your education of that discovery process whereby those thoughts were first made. And that's the most essential thing we found in helping people really get a sense of what it is to be human, to work through a discovery together, maybe a simple one with geometry or in music, something that's not as vague and not as many-sided as politics, but a geometric problem perhaps can help focus that. So I think that's really very much what we see. The idea that we're going to run out of resources is based on the idea that we're not human. If we were animals, we would run out of resources. We would reach a certain carrying capacity, but we are not animals as much as some people try to make us live that way.
Yeah. That's a really crucial insight. And I mean, it speaks to the whole modern foundation of modern thought. I mean, of the university, of the academic disciplines. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Alan Bloom, The Closing of the American Mind, and that he wrote in 1987. I think it's a brilliant book, and he always champions the study of ancient thought and its superiority over modern thought. And one of the distinctions, the crucial distinction he puts there, which I think most people skip over, is the idea that what was central to ancient thought was the idea of the human soul, and that this is totally absent from modern philosophy, politics, economics, etc. And I mean, I suppose it's because it's a very radical idea, and it undermines a certain interpretation of the Enlightenment. But it is absolutely crucial. I know that in the LaRouche movement, you've spoken about people like Bertrand Russell and his influence over the dominant Western ideas of man being an animal, and I suppose the whole Darwinian idea that we are nothing but animals, and there's this political implication of that. When you speak to, let's say, students on campus, do you find that sort of debate? Because I suppose that debate comes up in sometimes the Christian critiques of liberalism on campus, but it doesn't necessarily get to the issues that you're raising. But do you find any sort of connection when you visit campuses and
Oh, yeah, I would say so. What you brought up about this idea of the soul being absent, or of treating people as though we were animals, or maybe even going further and treating us as though we're just machines.
Yeah,
that the
that's
mind,
a new one.
Yeah, that the mind. I mean, this is sort of the underpinning idea of people who have aspirations for artificial intelligence replacing us. This would be possible if the mind was essentially like a machine. Now, that's a very big assumption to make. And it's not one that's been ever demonstrated. I mean, to demonstrate that, you'd actually have to create a mind from a machine. Of course, we haven't done that. People have a faith that eventually it will be possible simply because, well, what else could it be? And, and that ignores the very crucial thing about creative thought, which is that we make ideas that do not come from the ones in the past. I mean, they're provoked by them. Clearly, you do research, you think about things, and this leads you to make a new idea. But the new idea is not one that can be expressed in the old language. This is why we have to invent new languages. The nuclear physicists, they couldn't use the language of chemistry to talk about what they found. You need a whole new language. Leibniz created the calculus as an invention, as a language to improve the ability to talk about physics. So the idea that we're going to be able to express all future concepts in current language as a sort of, just a sort of a description, ignores the fact that we've had to change language dramatically before and to create just fundamentally new concepts. The way Einstein, he redefined what space, what time, what energy, what matter meant. Yeah. So if you were trying before that to sort of come up with a theory of everything using those concepts, the concepts themselves weren't even the right words, so to speak. But yes, we do definitely find people who are quite explicitly committed to this notion that the mind must be simply nothing but a machine. And, sometimes you go somewhere with people like that, sometimes you don't. But again, the process of going through a specific discovery can often be very, very helpful and very challenging for students like that. So to have an encounter with that can help.
I think that's also an important thing about the process of discovery, because it's even in I'm also involved with a type of education that super accelerated learning, and part of the way we try to embed knowledge in the right hemisphere as opposed to the left hemisphere, with the parallel processing as opposed to the linear processing and all that. Stories are so important, and storytelling, especially when you have some sort of epiphany in that story, it makes information stick. And I think that idea of epiphany and discovery, puts you in touch with your soul, actually, and where it comes from. I know people like Daniel Dennett and not David Chalmers necessarily. He's kind of wavering, but the debate on consciousness and AI, that's right. There's this idea that once you get once technology develops far enough, you'll get to an artificial mind that will supersede us. There was an interesting debate between Jack Ma and Elon Musk about this, that I saw on Twitter the other day. I can't remember what international forum it was, but Jack Ma Elon Musk was convinced that computers are already ahead of us, are smarter than us, and Jack Ma was definitely not of that view. So that was interesting there. But I remember an amazing piece by LaRouche in the 80s about the false premise of information. What was it called? Information science. I can't remember the term that was used at the time. It's no longer used anymore.
Oh, okay.
But it's not information technology. But there were like
information theory, perhaps. Okay.
Sorry.
Maybe information theory, or
it could be that. But this false idea that knowledge, like what we are doing now, is somehow equivalent to sticking a disk into a computer and transferring information. There's no disk transferring between us right now. These are, and it goes right back to Plato, when Plato talks about all we're doing is remembering things. That's how knowledge awakens. What we can only awaken knowledge in others as teachers. We are not we're not sticking a disc into your ear and downloading how to do karate like in the Matrix or something. Could you expand on that?
Sure. Well, like you brought up about the storytelling, that there's a certain human aspect to it. That's we relate to each other through these stories. We get into it. We think about what the person's thinking and all of this. It's definitely different from just a very dry explanation. It's human, and that's one thing, is that concepts, discoveries, are human discoveries. People make them, and when we communicate them to each other, I don't know if even sometimes when you share an aha moment with somebody, there's definitely something that you both have in your minds that seems like it's the same. I don't know if it's ever exactly the same, because any concept, it depends on your audience. When you're teaching, you have to tailor your lesson to who it is that you're speaking with. If you're having one-on-one lessons, you really have a lot of opportunity to do that, because, some kids or some students this approach might help them make a realization. For others, maybe a different approach is better, because you're communicating something that's not the words. Eventually, in your use of words and talking with somebody, the idea might be communicated, but it wasn't those words, as evidenced by the fact that sometimes you use different words to get across the same point to different people. The funny thing about that, Elon Musk and Jack Ma, when they were speaking with each other, one of the things that I had noted or that came up in that I think it was at the World Artificial Intelligence Conference or convention or something. One of the things that came up was human population. And I think they both agreed that there was a problem, that there were not enough people, that the birth rate was too low. So anyway, I thought that was interesting and contrary to what we hear about overpopulation being a terrible problem. I think that gets at part of it. Oh, it's a big topic. The human aspect of communication that you brought up.
And all this it's part of the problem, because when you're thinking of the world in terms of limited resources and exceeding carrying capacity, and we're nothing but animals, and human beings are a plague on this earth. I mean, it's really a new nihilism, and it's reached another level, because I don't think there has been this sort of collective nihilistic vision in human history before. It's been society-wide. There have been society-wide things in periods of decadence, of even Roman Empire and stuff like that. But this is like a global nihilism movement, and it's quite fascinating. I know you've spoken about before that you have been critical of the environmental movement for a long time. I believe before this whole anthropogenic global warming idea has been promoted. Can you just outline your critique of the environment? Because I mean, this whole thing about climate deniers, it's incredible. They're using the kind of Holocaust language to shut down debate, so that you would be an outcast because you're a climate denier. But your critique is, from what I understand, it started even before this, and I'm sure it's not motivated by a desire for you to destroy the environment, like critics say. Oh, you just want to destroy the planet. Obviously, you don't. But so how would you counter that? While showing your concern for collective well-being, obviously.
Sure, and I do want to also make a distinction between what we like the environmentalist movement that was created and really expanded from the 60s and into the 70s. Having air that's not going to cause health problems, that's a good thing. I agree with that. Having water that's safe to drink, of course, these are good goals. But the environmentalist movement, in the form it was created about 50 years ago, had other objectives. It was essentially created by some of the absolute top British oligarchs and oligarchical families. It was created in an era, so think in the 60s, this is when colonialism is being defeated, at least, formal colonialism. Nations are winning their independence. The British Empire, the French Empire, the British Empire that Roosevelt told Churchill was almost as, during World War II, Roosevelt fought with Churchill saying, why are we working together to defeat the Nazi and the Japanese empire, but allowing you to keep your empire? Why should you keep India? Is that significantly different from what Hitler's doing, taking over Europe?
Yeah.
So Roosevelt died. The end of the defeat of colonialism took some more decades. But in this context, this modern environmentalist movement was created as a new form, in my view, a new form of colonialism, to prevent nations from developing by saying, oh, this development threatens the natural order, threatens the environment, threatens parks where we like to go and shoot wild game, what have you.
Yeah.
So that the important thing to look at it is that environmental proposals and policies promoted under the idea of being green or environmentalist, these have significant costs. And I think people look at, oh, isn't it nice to care about the earth? And if you overlook the fact that trying to go carbon neutral within within any, with these time periods that are proposed, is going to mean a lot of dead people. It's going to mean dead people. There's no way. The only way you can achieve these goals put forward by the EU or Greta Thunberg or different nations, the UN, is going to be to dramatically reduce the ability to have energy availability, and that's a key component of survival of being a modern civilization. So that's really what had really has been irking me. Well, I've been fighting against that for a couple of decades because I saw the effects of these policies. It's devastating.
I'd like you to expand on that because it's a very important concept that Lyndon LaRouche developed, energy flux density, and understanding development in terms of that. Because when you say that energy is important for development, it's a fundamental idea that most people probably don't think about, but it's a key thing, I know, in your understanding of development and the economy. And so if you could just explain it for
Sure.
people to understand more.
Yeah, well, one broad measure and then a more specific one. I had, in a recent presentation, I just got some numbers from the World Bank, which has got a lot of data available online, looking at countries and simply making a chart of per capita electricity use and life expectancy. I mean, it's a very clear trend. You take a look at per capita electricity use and infant mortality. Obvious trend downwards. More energy, less infant mortality. More energy, healthier living. More energy, longer lifespans. So there's no two ways about it. You cannot have a long life for a civilization as a whole, a society, a nation having good lifespans, good living standards. You can't do it while being in poverty. And energy is, energy poverty is poverty. You need energy.
Yeah.
Now, there's a couple aspects of that. As far as the energy flux density goes, in terms of not only the amount of energy, but its quality, if you compare the energy that comes from a wood fire, you're just burning wood, you can get a certain amount of energy from that. Certain things. You can cook food. That's very important. You can use it to help, alter some materials. If you turn the wood into charcoal, now you can use it to create metal. That's something that you can't do with a wood fire. So you've made the fire more intense. You've increased the energy density of that fire by making charcoal from the wood. The development of coal as a major resource with the steam engine. Well, now you've just changed the whole landscape of the world. Coal is now something that's like finding a stream of water that you can use for a water wheel. You can use coal now to create motion wherever you'd like it. Totally changes the earth, liberates us from physical labor or from using animals for that physical labor, or water or wind, old technologies. So the real breakthrough on this is going to be nuclear fusion. And we already have nuclear fission, which is tremendously more efficient, tremendously more powerful than any chemical reaction. With nuclear fusion, with recreating what is taking place in the sun, we can have individual reactions, putting together two hydrogens, or hydrogen and helium, and getting out of that one combination 2 million times more energy than we get from one molecule, say, of natural gas. 2 million times more. So as we discover more about what's going on in the very small in nature, the nucleus, the forces involved in the nucleus are simply 1 million times stronger than the electrical bonds that make up chemical molecules. So it makes sense that as the energy use in society increases, as the quality of that energy use increases, more and more towards electricity, as opposed to just burning fuel for heat. It's a higher quality of energy. And then the physics that allows us to unlock the higher energy densities by moving towards the nucleus as opposed to chemical reactions.
So now how do you address the environmentalists who would say, well, yes, we will be increasing human longevity and human prosperity, but it's at the cost of the environment. It's at the cost of the earth. That what we're doing is we're destroying the earth for our own gain. How do you address that criticism?
Well, one of the ways is to sort of try to bring it into being something more specific. You brought up earlier how effective narratives are at conveying things, at
Yeah.
telling a story. So when there's sort of this image painted of almost like two opposing sports teams or something, like the people are here and the earth is here, and if the people win, the earth loses. Or that somehow when we're developing, we're hurting the earth. You got to make it more specific. Say, in what way? Like, at least in the United States, the air is cleaner than it was 30 years ago, despite having more cars, more people, because the cars are cleaner, because we have standards for, actual pollution, like soot in the air. That's really a problem. And it's dramatically down in the past 30 years in the US. So the big thing to do is to try to get more specific about it. And that's why the global warming thing is so tough, because it's so all encompassing. Carbon dioxide is almost a proxy for economic development. I mean, essentially, that's
it's life, isn't it?
Yeah.
we
Yes.
breathe out carbon dioxide.
Carbon dioxide. Almost all of our energy production breathes out carbon dioxide. So, that's why it is uniquely so effective, because unlike something like soot in particulate matter in the air, which is easily measured and it's not hard to see if it's going up or down, the idea of relying on models of the entire Earth. Now, I'm not saying science isn't amazing, but the idea that I wouldn't be so certain that we've totally figured out how the entire Earth works when we know so little, for example, about what's our resolution on our spatial resolution of knowing the temperatures in the oceans. It's very poor. We have very little idea at different depths what the temperatures are like. This is hugely significant. What's the impact of cosmic radiation and cloud formation, and how does the sun moderate that? I don't believe that's even included in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change models. So, I think it's being used as an effective way of getting people to sort of say, you know what, this is very complex. I just have to trust the scientists. And if you don't agree, it must be because you hate science or you're stupid.
Yeah, exactly.
But then the way that the discussion ends up becoming, like I was talking with a guy on a campus, and I just brought up some of these points, like, well, how certain are we about this? How do we, et cetera? What are the costs? And he said, well, but scientists say it's true, so shouldn't we believe them? He said, if an architect told you there was a 50% chance of your house burning down unless you made changes, wouldn't you make the changes? I said, no. I'd ask the architect why he says that.
Yeah.
We should actually talk it through and not just, rely on this popular opinion under the name of science.
Exactly. And if the architect tells you, well, you're going to have to quit your job and work at the retail store just across the street and walk to work, and then use half your income to to break down your house, and you're going to have to live in one room because the architect,
right, and pay double the rent. Yeah, so
exactly. It depends on what the architect is telling you and why, and what evidence there is behind it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But and there's another story too. Just on my end, if you don't mind me just sharing it with you, we have the group that I'm involved in here in Trinidad and Tobago. We have been trying to put together this very pioneering, ecologically harmonious, but also technologically advanced sort of development on the north coast of our island, on these mountains where not much development has happened at all. And there were all sorts of opposition that we had faced. And one of them was, about what would happen to the wildlife and everything. But we got the authorities to measure all of this. And in fact, when our development came, the wildlife population increased. It flourished. Because that was actually one of the things we wanted to happen, right? We wanted life to increase and not decrease. And so all these species, because we were preventing illegal hunters from coming on and poaching, and we were allowing certain trees that the animals were eating to grow, and cutting down the other trees that were, essentially weeds and more parasitic type of species. But this is the human intervention in the environment. Another person who I really love is Buckminster Fuller. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. And the way he has articulated it, and I think he died in around the mid 80s sometime. But he had articulated it that human beings are the universe's consciousness, and it's the way the universe becomes self-conscious and aware of its own laws. So that we are agents of life, of anti-entropy. Life is anti-entropy, and so we are adding abundance, and that's our role as human beings. Yeah. How do you elaborate on that?
Well, I think that's a beautiful story that you told. That people, because it shows how sometimes people just have in their mind an axiom that if we do it, it's bad for the earth. Instead of saying, well, let's get more specific about it. Let's look at some details here. If you have a desert and you take ocean water and you desalinate it and bring water to the desert and life is flourishing, how is that bad? What is so inherently good about a desert, I mean, as long as we still have a few on Earth that we can study for biological interests, that's fine. But it's just, it's just dry. It's just by chance that it's dry. We can make it better. So I just think that illustrates very perfectly the necessity to be specific about these things, to really say, well, what do we do? What impact do we do? If we push back deserts, if we're planting trees, hey, in other words, what's your metric? If bad just means we did it, well, then it's very hard to have a conversation. But if you actually have some specific standards of what you're trying to promote, oh, this would be a good improvement. Oh, no, this would be a setback. Then you can actually answer the questions by thinking it through and not just saying human equals bad.
Yeah,
which is
exactly.
Lazy thinking.
And so now let's take this into the Belt and Road Initiative part, because now the environmental movement, I know that the LaRouche movement has pointed to the way the World Bank and the IMF actually, far from promoting development in the developing world, the formerly colonized world, the poor areas of the world, have actually prevented it because of environmental concerns. Like, for example, I just came back from doing a project in Guyana, and Guyana is the size of the UK, but its population is 750,000 people. So
wow.
Yeah, and it has abundant mineral resources, water resources. It's now discovered abundant oil and gas resources, but the population lives in poverty, and there are all sorts of political and social problems there, and there's been this whole, and that illustration of a land the size of Great Britain with just a population of 750,000, I think is an indicative, just as a perfect illustration of what underdevelopment actually is. And could you, and how the Belt and Road Initiative is the opposite of this. So could you elaborate on that for me?
Sure. To me, it takes a lot of gall for The Economist or the Financial Times or for the British to complain about the Chinese acting as a colonial power. I just think really, let's compare. Tough negotiation on interest rates on a loan to build a railroad, and you're going to compare that with killing local leaders, enslaving the population. Yeah, great.
Exactly.
No comparison. And even on the finance, the World Bank, the IMF, the amount of debt that was built up through loans for projects or just loans for continued operating costs that came with conditionalities, demands made upon those nations by the IMF, by other Western creditors. This was acknowledged it was almost about 10 years ago now. I'm a little bit bad on my date on this, but the HIPC initiative, the heavily indebted poor countries,
Right.
where a
Yeah.
lot of this debt was forgiven out of a recognition of, hey, we built up debt. Anyway, so to compare that with the Chinese investments, which are investments not on finance per se or operating funds, these are by and large all related to investments that can improve the productivity of the nation.
Yeah.
When China, as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, offers a loan for the construction of a railroad or for the construction of a hydroelectricity plant, or makes credit available for the building of factories or of power generation. This isn't like, giving a loan to take care of a foreign reserves issue. This is investing in the kinds of things that make the nation more productive and able to repay them.
Yeah.
Right? That's the key. So, some of the institutes that have done the most research on this, like the China Africa Research Initiative or Institute, I forget, the CARI coming out of Johns Hopkins University. The people there, they've done their best to research almost every loan from China into Africa. They've done the best that they can. And their conclusions are that there's no nation in Africa that's being put into debt distress as a result of Chinese investment. The whole debt trap idea, the idea that China's colonizing with this, essentially only stems from, and the only example ever given is the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, which was built with Chinese.
Yeah.
There's just a couple examples.
Two examples.
Right.
Always.
Okay. So if you think of all of these projects, and if there's two examples, there's many ways that you can make a bad investment. Maybe a local leader really wants a project for vanity reasons, or maybe you make a mistake in your predictions about port capacity. You don't have to assume that it's out of an evil desire to indebt countries and then take them over, which China simply has not been doing. China forgives debt. There was recently some loans from Venezuela within the past year that had come up, and China simply forgave them. It often simply forgives debt, especially when it was offered or put forward at 0% interest rates. So it's just an attack on the fact that there's a new paradigm that's taking the world, and the transatlantic power sector is not the only game in town anymore, as I think the British thought it was ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, I mean, from our experience in Trinidad and Tobago, we've had one of the shortest experiences with the IMF, thankfully, but it was horrendous when it did happen. I mean, the rest of the Caribbean, has had a far worse experience with the IMF. And that's why the IMF is like a dirty word here. Whenever in the 80s, when it happened with the huge recession for us, it put us back 20 years, definitely. It set our development back by decades, and we have not yet recovered from it fully. But I always tell people, I mean, the Chinese have never told any country, like the IMF told us, to devalue your currency, just to remove subsidies from fuel, to remove food subsidies, to remove any sort of transfers to poor people, to sell off your natural assets. The Chinese don't do that. The IMF do that all the time with the structural adjustment programs to devalue your currency and effectively wipe out people's savings and international purchasing power. And yet, they have the gall, as you say, to talk about. I mean, it's projection, obviously. It's a psychological projection that's happening. It's quite amazing. I mean, we had. The state had invested, substantial amounts of money in the 1970s during what we call the oil boom, and I suppose in America what you call the energy crisis, because we're an oil-producing nation. But that was a time when we were getting lots of money, and the state had developed a world-class industrial estate producing methanol, ammonia, iron and steel, and nitrogenous fertilizers. It was not making money. by the time it launched in the 80s because prices went down, all sorts of things. But eventually it was privatized in the 1990s under this whole IMF program, and for us to pay back our debt to China. It became one of the leading industrial centers in the world, and amazing for a small island like ourselves. Number one exporter of ammonia in the world, right from here. Number one exporter of methanol in the world, right from here. It was a place where Lakshmi Mittal set up his first overseas steel plant, and then he built his empire right from here. But we had to sell it all to Western companies. So none of it is in local hands anymore. I mean, we get taxes from it, and the government uses that, but all of it had to be sold off in the early 90s. And that, that was, that's what the IMF in the West does all the time, right? And yet this whole China imperialist idea, and the amazing thing is that people in Trinidad and Tobago, for example, believe the propaganda they're hearing from CNN, even though we've experienced the exact opposite, So this is really amazing. But I know Dennis Small from the LaRouche movement, the LaRouche PAC and Schiller Institute, was talking about the Darien Gap in Nicaragua, which has been fought over a long time. That I think much of the Contra Sandinista battle in the 70s was also around that, like a new Panama Canal going through Lake Managua. But the IMF, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the IMF and the World Bank prohibited any development there because of environmental concerns, and so the people live in poverty. Could you sort of elaborate on
yeah. Well, there's a case, like, if I wanted to drive down to visit a friend in Brazil, I can't do it, because in Central America at this Darien Gap, there's no road and there is a park. So apparently this park is so essential that there's simply no way you could put a road through it, because you could never, ever sustain the loss of this swampland along the length of a road here. So it's a perfect example of, it's a very strong example of what's presented as an environmentalist concern being used to achieve other policy objectives. It happens all the time in politics. People put forward a certain rationale, even though it's not what's driving them to make the argument in the first place. So that's a perfect example. I think with the Belt and Road, these attacks are really falling flat, I believe, in Africa. Because the African nations that are dealing with China, they know what it's like. They know what it's like working with these Chinese companies or financing means. So it's the propaganda I don't think has been terribly effective where China's been an established player. It's the sort of thing that happens and is promoted here as part of a broader goal of stopping China's growth. So you brought up about what's your view of human beings earlier, and that the way that China's rise is being presented as an inherent threat, it's almost like saying our development must naturally hurt the earth. To say China's growth is naturally a threat to us. First off, why should the U.S. consider itself to be forever and always the number one nation on the planet, even when there's countries with 4 or 5 times as many people in them? I mean, these are people? Yeah. These are human beings just like us. So, the idea that these people should have less of a say in the world because they're from another country, it's very silly. China's growth is good for everyone. Developing countries come up with new technologies. They do research. It's also just good to know that our fellow human beings are living better lives in any part of the world. So, I think that's the real thing here. The debt trap stuff, it's not true. It's, people who really look into it know it's not true. It's just being used as a reason that people can point to in order to support a policy that they actually like for other reasons, namely holding China back, which it won't work.
Yeah, I mean, it really seems that, the media, I just find it quite amazing the way the media and the think tanks are grabbing back at like it seems to me. I remember when I was young, this idea of the yellow peril, that used to see that they used to talk about China and swamping the world, and it's like they're just reaching back easily, pulling that, lock, stock, and barrel, and just plopping it today, and I can't believe the discourse is still has currency, and just like it's just like the anti-Russian thing today. They're just going back to Cold War,
Yeah.
Cold War tropes,
Yes.
flopping it today, and like nobody's even. I can't believe how unself-conscious.
Right. Right. And also, there's something about who the audience is. So I've
Yeah,
been at Belton Road, events of the Belton Road Initiative in New York City and in Washington. In Washington and around there, the view is very negative. It's, China's trying to take over the world. This is terrible. We have to maintain dominance and so forth. In New York City, the meetings I had been at were related to business groups, and they said, "Oh, this is great. This means good business. We can work together. Hey, this is going to be great for the economy. Wonderful." So you
yeah,
sort of get the difference between people who actually see an opportunity when it's presented to them versus people who've got this sort of political identity. Their occupation is in being part of this horrendous establishment that's trying
yeah.
to,
Geopolitics,
yeah,
etc. Yeah,
geopolitics. It's over. What an old-fashioned,
yeah,
I was meeting with a Japanese, excuse me, a Chinese official, and he was saying geopolitics. We aren't, wearing, animal skins and stabbing each other with spears anymore. We're civilized people. We can get along. I mean,
yeah. No,
this is the
and
modern world.
and the difference you talk about the New York businessman in Washington D.C. I mean that's emblematic of Trump, right? I mean, he is the New York businessman
Yes.
who thought China, it'd be great to do deals with China,
Right,
and
right, right.
so that contradiction is there uh, in Washington D.C. now, and I mean, uh, thank God, just to bring up another current event, that John Bolton is gone. I mean, but that was
Yes.
part of the contradiction, So, and I don't know why Trump had him in the first place. People talk about 4D chess and stuff. I that would be like 36D chess because it really took us to the edge. But
Yeah.
yeah, but the contradiction is manifested right there. Like, so it's kind of Trump talks about draining the swamp, but he has them, and in his cabinet, and he's constantly fighting them, and it seems like his campaign promises of friendship with Russia, friendship with China, which would just bring tremendous prosperity to the world. I mean, imagine if Russia, China, the United
Mm.
States, and India, of course, come together for global development. What that would mean for global prosperity and development. I mean, and it's totally against the great game of the British Empire of the 19th century to make sure China and Russia and India were constantly against each other. But yeah, I mean, what do you see about what do you see there about the Trump presidency and the friendship with China and Russia that he initially was championing, but it just seems like it's gotten totally derailed. What's your view on that?
Well, it is true. I mean, you brought up that Trump is a New York businessman in Washington, and that's exactly true. He doesn't have deep-seated connections to defense contractors. He didn't come in with any of this kind of thing. He didn't have a bizarre political outlook about hegemony. He was making deals and doing business. He was doing what he was doing. And he's had a number of very rotten people around him that have, for whatever reason, he's appointed to positions in his administration. John Bolton was, I think, easily the worst, or certainly among the tied for worst, if he wasn't
Yeah.
um, absolutely the worst person. So, I think that him being fired, excellent news. The potential to really get a good deal is very important because, Trump said, China has been, and when he was campaigning, he said, look, it's not China's fault that we were asleep at the switch. He said,
Yeah.
China grew, we weren't. That's our fault. That's not China's fault. And I don't know. I'm really not sure how much of this foolishness with the trade talks is related to terrible advice he's getting, if it's related to concern about the U.S. economy not looking as great now as he had been, as it had seemed to. Much of which was the stock market growing, which is not, an indicator of success.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure, but the way forward is definitely to not have an antagonistic relationship towards China. Drop the idea that China's growth is itself a problem. And there's just some of these kind of old-fashioned views that I think still float around, like China got where it is by stealing technologies. Look, the point is today China is able to create new technologies, and everyone would benefit from relationships with a nation that's doing new things and developing new concepts and that can improve the lives of everyone. I mean, China landed on the far side of the moon. The US never did that. They didn't steal that technology.
That's right.
They did that
exactly.
as a first.
Exactly. And I mean, if you want to go about stealing technology, you could go to the compass and, and paper. And all
or you can go to the NSA, which has been spying, for commercial reasons, for years, as revealed by the Snowden documents.
And so I know you. I mean, you do a lot of work. You have your regular podcasts. You write papers and stuff all the time. But you recently, I don't know how long ago it was, you wrote Extending the New Silk Road to West Asia and Africa with Hussein Askari, who I've also spoken to on the podcast. Yeah, I was just asking how long ago you wrote that Extending the New Silk Road into West Asia and Africa, and you said 2 years ago. But can you just sort of summarize the main points of that report?
Sure. So we were looking at what's definitely going to be the most dynamic, the part of the world with the most growth over the coming couple of generations, which is Africa and Southwest Asia, also called the Middle East. This is a region that's going to see tremendous population growth. The average age in Africa right now is under 20 years. So this is a very young population. It's a growing population. And in many ways, these are areas that have so far been quite undeveloped compared to what their potential could be. So the opportunity for growth there is just absolutely huge and absolutely tremendous. What China's been doing with its investment projects, with the Belt and Road Initiative, has been helping to unlock that potential. So the kinds of projects that we discuss in our report are not only what China's already doing and planning to do, but taking a broader perspective, keying off of some of the Agenda 2063 initiatives of the African Union, looking at proposals for high-speed rail along the North African coast, about connecting the capitals among the entire continent. Building up and finishing the Trans-African Highway Network, the Trans-African Railway Networks, water projects like the refilling of Lake Chad by redirecting less than 10% of the water from the upper tributaries of the Congo River, which is plenty of water in the Congo River, and redirecting less than 10% of that to refill Lake Chad, which is shrunk to below a fifth of its size and is endangering lives of tens of millions by the loss of economic potential from that shrinking lake. Or energy projects, such as the Grand Inga Dam project for hydropower. It's a hydro complex that would be on the Congo River in the Democratic Republic of Congo, one of the most energy-starved nations in this world. That single complex of hydro in a very small area, it's a perfect location, huge elevation drop, huge water flow. This could provide power for tens of millions of people. And it's another example of where the World Bank, which had been looking at it, dropped it a couple of years ago for, among other reasons, environmental concerns.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, that's quite incredible that these major developments for human welfare have been, not even considered or rejected by, the major international development financing.
Right, and yeah, the World Bank, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Well, so much for that development. So these are the kinds of things that we cover in this report. So it's sort of an overview of the infrastructure potentials, discussion about the space program in various nations, science potentials, resources, and the economic outlook of LaRouche and the Schiller Institute in terms of how these potentials can be unlocked, what the metrics should be for deciding on projects, how to develop metrics that aren't financial, but are able to really comprehend the physical economic benefits of investments. So I think it's a very useful report for getting a sense of what the potential is in this area of the world that is going to see the most growth over the next half century.
Right. Now, were these projects that were identified by yourselves or projects in the works already under the Belt and Road Initiative, or it's like so how much of this was sort of your own identifying of what needs to be done as opposed to projects that already are being talked about?
Well, I'd say we did a sense of prioritization in terms of, because there's a lot of proposals that have been made really for many years. For example, this proposal to refill Lake Chad, this has been discussed for decades. It's now really making progress due to some collaboration between China and Italy.
Right.
This was first promoted by an Italian engineering firm decades ago, and had been supported by the LaRouche movement since then. Some of the projects.
That's amazing, if you don't mind me interrupting there, between China and Italy. So the supposed racist government of Matteo Salvini. So they are doing this amazing transformative project in Africa. Again, it's the whole propaganda against these administrations. But go on. Sorry.
No, I know. Sometimes facts don't matter if you're just intent on pushing it. Trump was just at the, and I'll get back to, Trump was just at the national, I think, conference or a national gathering of leaders among the historically Black colleges and universities of the United States. Trump went there, gave a speech, pointed out how much federal funding, I believe it's maybe about 13% increase under his administration to the historically Black colleges and universities. So I don't know how widely that's going to be reported or if people are going to try and paint it as a negative, but people have an agenda, they're just going to say things. Like Nancy Pelosi saying that the firing of John Bolton was bad because, it creates instability. Anyway, and then also the projects also include things particularly that Hussein had been working on with contacts of his in the area, making some specific new proposals on water development in Egypt and beyond. So it's sort of a comprehensive overview. It gives a sense of what projects are most important and about the kind of financing that makes it possible. And of course, it takes on some of these myths and attacks on the Belt and Road Initiative. We address in that report the debt trap hoax and other concerns that are being raised about China scheming to take over the world by building railroads.
Yeah. And now, in the 2 years since it's been written, have you seen a lot of progress on what you've identified in the report, or how's it been? Because the whole movement of the world economy and geopolitics is kind of hampering a lot of progress, I think, in these areas. So what's movement actually been like?
Well, overall, the movement is positive. I mean, Africa is developing. And I don't mean that in the sense of it's not developed, but developing, but literally developing in particular. So, and there are things that are difficult, like the conflict in Yemen, conflict situations in the Middle East that make this difficult. But even, the oil-rich nation of Saudi Arabia has been signing contracts for nuclear power plants. High-speed rail in Morocco is moving forward. Many transportation and manufacturing projects are moving forward on the African continent as a whole, including contracts signed within the past couple of years on expanding rail in Nigeria, in going from Senegal all the way east across the continent in the northern part of it. So there's been a lot of, I'd say a lot of progress. Since the report was written, the announcement that China Hydro and the Italian government were going to put tens of millions of dollars into expanding the study of this project to refill Lake Chad. That's very promising. And other contracts since the report was written for hydropower in Uganda comes to mind. There's just a lot. Things are moving forward, and that is a good thing. And I think a lot of people have to recalibrate or reset their image of Africa as this hopeless place where you're supposed to send charity, and realize, wait, no, this is a developing part of the world where, of course, it varies country by country, but it's
dynamic.
It's dynamic. It's moving. The China-Africa fora are continuing to see, $60 billion, tens of billions of dollars of investment.
For the past 20 years, in the top 10 fastest growing economies, it's consistently had a number of sub-Saharan economies, and not just the same ones. I mean, it's showing throughout the continent, in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as above the Sahara as well, that there's been growth happening all over the place consistently for 20 years. That never happened under British and French colonialism, as far as that.
Oh, no. I'll tell you, it's funny. On the campuses recently, I've had the experience when speaking with students about, they'd say, well, but why promote the idea that CO2 is this grave danger if it isn't? Who benefits? And it's, well, have you ever heard of empire? And, a couple of African students that I had met where the discussion took this direction said, well, did the British Empire want to develop its colonies? And of course, they lived it. They said, of course not, obviously not. So the idea of stopping development, preventing development as a goal of empire, it's very clear to people who've, got a historical sense of it. And it's definitely continued since colonialism officially ended.
Absolutely. So I mean, and this is one of the great things I admire about the LaRouche movement and the work that you guys have been doing. That you really look for real world effects and impacts, and you have made them throughout throughout the history of the movement, from the 70s right up to today. 70s, 80s, right up to today. And so I guess in moving the interview to a close, because we've been talking for a while, with all this work you've been doing, and constantly, I mean, you're constantly producing content all the time. What would you say the main impact that you'd like to realistically achieve? What's the main thing? I know you've got a lot of campaigns going on. What's sort of the main thing you're focusing on right now to push forward?
The main thing right now is to break through this. I'd say, well, I'll try to say two main things.
Yeah.
One of them is to break through on this suicide policy that's come under this green title. The other really major one is for, at least in the United States, for the U.S. to take policies that represent its own self-interest. We should be working with Russia, we should be working with China, we should be working with India, get these four nations together. We can set a better course for the world economy. And to do that, we're going to have to be willing to go against the world of finance, the Wall Street, City of London, grouping that has been given such power, so much benefit, so many bailouts, so much. It's being essentially almost given the keys to the government. That has to be stopped, and a policy of physical economic growth has to be instated immediately. Trump has pointed to job growth, wage growth, this sort of thing. Our infrastructure is still in terrible shape. We need to spend trillions of dollars building rail, water treatment systems, urban transit. The needs are absolutely huge, absolutely immense. And the real driver, I think, over the decades to come is going to be taking long-term goals in space. That'll be something we can look to for many years to come, maybe 2 generations to come, that are going to require a whole train of technologies and scientific breakthroughs we don't have right now. That's really the key to sustain long-term economic growth. It's possible for many countries in the world to develop right now and to grow using currently existing technologies. But if we're really going to move mankind to the next level, we need developments like nuclear fusion. This is going to be an absolute key. And to expand our scientific reach by science sitting on the moon, for example.
Yeah. So what have you seen as the main obstacles right now for you to achieve the impact you want to have? Well, what are the forces that really are lining up against you guys? Because I mean, over the years there have been many.
Yeah, well, there certainly have. I mean, LaRouche was thrown in prison. That was a significant obstacle. But it also makes sense because it meant that he was doing something right and was seen as a threat. That threat still exists. So for us to achieve these policies, I think that what's really very crucial is to change patterns of thought or to overcome axioms of thought that prevent good thinking. So one of those we talked about earlier was the image of the human species, this unfortunately very prevalent view that we are either worse than animals or the same as animals or the same as machines. And I think that this is also having an impact in holding back science from what it could be doing by sort of artificially constraining what's considered to potentially be a new scientific principle. That goes along then with the green ideology, which sees us as animals or as a problem, which fails to recognize the potential to develop new technologies to redefine what resources are. So in a certain sense, the image of the human species, I think, comes to be again and again the most central issue, and figuring out new and better ways and implementing those ways of helping people get acquainted with their real human selves, I think is probably the greatest need.
Yeah. You know, you're a relatively young guy, and you've been with this movement for a long time. So probably since you were a teenager, were you
early 20s?
Early 20s, okay, yeah. Or late teens, I was wondering. So I mean, what really drew you to the movement? What was it that first? Because I suppose it would have been radically different from so many of the other things you might have been exposed to, or I don't know. Maybe you personally had these ideas and then you found this movement. How did that come about for you?
Well, it's kind of a combination. I mean, I first encountered the LaRouche movement tabling on my campus. They had a sign up about why something about the IMF, and I hated the IMF, so I thought, oh, this sounds great. But then, it kind of took me a while to learn more about it. What really got me was the personality of LaRouche. I eventually came to a meeting. A video from LaRouche was played. I think a campaign video he had made for the Michigan primary in the year 2000. And I thought, who is this man? Who is this man? He either knows what he's talking about or he's crazy. And I guess I should figure out which. So, getting involved then in political activity with the LaRouche movement, specifically around the deregulation of energy in California, where this blind idea that free markets were always the best was applied to the electricity generation network, which of course led to high prices, shortages. It was a complete disaster. And going with the LaRouche movement up to the state capitol and going door to door and speaking to these offices of these legislators, I gave me a very firsthand sense that, wow, this country really is, we do need to change, or we are doomed. This is the political leadership. And then, so I looked around. There's a lot of different political movements inside the United States, different kinds of think tanks, but I just found that this was it seemed most accurate and didn't require a compromise on my part, as opposed to saying, well, maybe I'll join an anti-environmentalist group, which is totally stupid about the economy, or, some libertarian group, which, is unkind and hates people, or, it just seemed like the most effective because it was taking on the most key issues, and because I learned so much through it. I mean, I didn't agree with everything that LaRouche had to say by any means.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that I to this day agree with everything that
Yeah.
he said.
Yeah.
You know,
Me too. I mean, me
yeah.
too. Yeah.
But I thought, okay, this is a movement that's, these people is definitely committed to making something happen and to following the truth wherever it goes. Not being afraid to just, if this is the right thing to do, let's do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
And so, what would you recommend to a young person who's listening to this podcast? What if they are also, you know, looking at what's happening in the world and want to make a positive difference, and I suppose they're bombarded with all the Extinction Rebellion and this other type of stuff, and Orange Man Bad and and all this stuff, and Putin's puppet and etc.
Right.
What would you recommend to a young person who maybe is not is questioning all this stuff?
Well, look, I'd say get involved with us. I mean, we've got a huge amount of material and videos at both the LaRouche PAC site, on the Schiller Institute website, conferences, presentations. There's so much there, and there's a lot of ways to get involved. I mean, right now, so yesterday, tomorrow, we're engaging in this international attempt to spread this message, to recruit. And so even including Antarctica, we've got activity on all the continents of the Earth this week and in the future. So there's definitely a potential. I would say get in touch, and then let's talk about what can be done. Depending on what country you're in, depending on what part of the world you're in, there's possibilities from creating discussion groups to speaking to your local government, to running for office, to creating a think tank, to studying and reporting on new ideas, to doing research on what kind of development projects are needed for your area of the world or of your nation, to start developing some expertise in this and to be able to provide leadership. But I'd say please get in touch with us through the websites that we have, and we are soliciting volunteers and activists all around the world. So wherever you are, I think that we can work together.
Excellent. That's at larouchepac.com. larouchepac.com, is it?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah,
and
then Schiller.
SchillerInstitute.com, I believe. SchillerInstitute.com.
Right.
So
I'll put the links in. I'll put the links in the description so people can check it out. I encourage everybody to learn more. They have a tremendous archive. It would take a lifetime of reading to go through everything. It's quite an incredible amount of work they have produced and continue to produce on a daily basis. I'm not lying, daily basis. Their stamina is incredible, and the insight is fascinating. You may not agree with everything, but it certainly makes you think, definitely. So, Jason, I want to thank you so much, not only for this interview, but really for all the work you've been doing for so many years. I admire your dedication, your conviction, your passion, and your integrity. And I wish you every success in your long campaign, and I fully support you guys.
Yeah. Thank you very much. It was really great having the chance to speak with you today.
Yeah, I enjoyed it myself. That's all for Independent Thought and Freedom this week. Please join us again next week, and in the meanwhile, make sure you subscribe, leave me a rating, like and share this podcast with your friends. Thanks, and bye for now.